Hello, movie nerds, and welcome back to Cinematic Sarcastic, the podcast that talks all things movies and television. I'm Natalie, and I'm your host. On today's episode, we are going to talk about Manhunt. This is the new conspiracy fiction television series that just dropped on Appletv, and this show is the conspiracy around and the manhunt of John Wilkes Booth, who was the man responsible for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with this television series, I have some mixed feelings about this one, and we will get into it. This whole series is not so much necessarily based around Abraham Lincoln as it is John Wilkes Booth. As the title suggests, this really kind of goes around the conspiracy of the assassination and then the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, as I stated. Now, I think that there are only 2 episodes for the season out currently. I have only made it through 1 of them, and I am not really a fan. I think really what it's going to come down to is the style of television that you like to watch, or like the style of how that series is portrayed, where Manhunt for me is very annoying is that they really swap back and forth between different timelines constantly. And I am not so much a fan of that. I don't mind when a movie or a television series has like flashbacks or there are different sort of perspectives happening and so you're changing between them. But just within like the first 30 minutes of the first episode, I think that we had swapped between different timelines at least 15, 16 times. Like it is almost every other scene is a flash to a different time. You have, early John Wilkes Booth. You have early Abraham Lincoln and the relationships that he has. You have right before the assassination. You have during the assassination. You have right after the assassination. Like there are just so many different timelines happening and they're switching back and forth pretty, quickly between all of them. So by the time that you're settled into one particular timeline, you've swapped into a completely different one. And I am not a fan of that style of television series. I really am more of like a linear kind of person in terms of how I want my shows to go. Like if you have to do a flashback, that's okay. I don't necessarily want them to be every 2 to 3 minutes. And Manhunt for me just swaps between these different timelines way too often for myself to find it enjoyable. Not only that, and this is going to sound maybe not so great, but I feel like the story of Abraham Lincoln has been talked about so much, and we've seen movies about him quite often, that this is just not as exciting to me personally as something else would be. Like, I'm not necessarily interested in hearing this story again, even if it's telling me a new sort of part of it, because none of this is really new, if that makes sense. Like, I already know Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and I already know the conspiracy that was going on behind the scenes. And so really you're kind of just seeing it again on TV. Now, I will say, I think that the casting of Anthony Boyle as John Wilkes Booth was a fantastic one. I think he looks nearly identical to John Wilkes Booth, just in how they did the makeup and the hair. But I was not necessarily a fan of their casting job for Abraham Lincoln, which is played by Hamish Linklater. Now, I really do like Hamish as an actor. I have enjoyed a lot of the television shows and things that he has been in, but I don't necessarily find him believable as Abraham Lincoln. Like, I sort of look to someone like Daniel Day-Lewis, who played in the movie Lincoln, I think in like 2012. And I really loved his portrayal, and I think that he actually resembled him. Whereas Hamish doesn't really necessarily look like Lincoln to me in the show. besides the fact that they've slapped, a beard on him and give him like a really tall top hat. Like that's really as far as it goes. He still looks like himself in the show as far as I am concerned. So that took me a little bit out of it. And also on top of that, I know that historically, when people talk about Abraham Lincoln, they talk about how rare it was that he was like 6'4". He was exceptionally tall for that time frame. And then of course he accentuated that by wearing a very tall top hat. Whereas in Manhunt, like a lot of the other actors that they have cast in sort of like but the before assassination scenes are also quite tall. Like Tobias Menzies, who plays Edwin Stanton in the show, is like 6'1". So everyone around Hamish, really, in Abraham Lincoln, I guess, because that's who he plays, they're all also quite tall, which just sort of downplays how tall Abraham Lincoln would have been at the time. Like, I really think the only time that you get to see sort of that height difference or how tall he looks perspective wise is the very few scenes that you see him together with his wife. His wife was obviously quite a bit shorter than him. So I don't know. This one is just not a win for me. I found it a little bit slow, even though really within the first 30 minutes you do get to witness like the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It's not something that I am necessarily super excited about, like this particular bit of history. And I think that really it just comes down to, if you really love Abraham Lincoln, if you are a history buff, if you really like that sort of Civil War era stuff, and you are interested in hearing about them searching for and hunting down and the inevitable death, I guess, of John Wilkes Booth, then Manhunt is going to be the show for you, and kind of like the conspiracy of what was going on, all of the planning beforehand, because they do show some of the stuff that, obviously John Wilkes Booth was not working alone. There were, several other men who were in the group with him that assassinated, I want to say, the Secretary of State as well. And there was supposed to be some other men who they took down at the same time that for reasons or another didn't actually happen. But for me, this one is not a win. I guess it's really going to come down to personal enjoyment and the things that you really like. Again, if you really like history or you're really into Abraham Lincoln, I think this one will be a win. But if not, and if you're not necessarily into this type of thing, it's probably not going to be a win for you, as it was not necessarily a win for me. So those are my thoughts on Manhunt. I would love to know what you guys thought if you have watched this one. Subscribe if you want to join the Movie Nerd family, and I hope to see you in the next episode.